Sorry, should I take it away? Sorry, oh no.
We'll wait just a few more seconds, David, for people to come in.
Yeah, of course. Sorry, I suddenly feared that pause was because I was meant to be talking. But...
Great. Well, let me go ahead and start us off. Just say welcome to everyone for this next lecture in this series on key concepts in macroeconomic development. This is, for many of you, not the first lecture, and probably many of you have joined us already for a number of lectures. We're really delighted to have David Atkin here today to give the next lecture in the sequence. Just a word about ground rules, and I think everybody's probably familiar with this by now. Those of you who are in the virtual front row here have control of over your microphones and your cameras. If you can leave your cameras on, that's great. David has said he's happy to take questions along the way. And then we'll also ask David to leave a bit of time in the last 15 minutes or so to field questions from all of you and from the broader group. For those of you not in the front row, David won't be able to see if you put your hand up. So what we ask you to do is to put your questions in the Q&A, where I and possibly others will do our best to answer as many as we can. And the ones we can't answer, we'll make David answer at the end. So those are what I've got to say on the ground rules. I guess beyond that, what I'd really like to do is to take a moment just to thank the United Kingdom's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, which funds the STEG program, and which is therefore the source of the whole operation. But although they fund the program, I would just say again that the lecturers who are taking part in this series are really doing this out of their own kindness and intellectual generosity. We really appreciate David taking the time today, and I want to thank him. I also want to thank the team at CEPR, Nadine Clark, Kirsty McNeil, Lauren Waring, Mandy Chan, who's been sending out emails even when she's doing other things. And so we really appreciate all the help that we get from them. So David, on that note, and without further ado, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you very much. Can everyone see my screen okay?
Perfectly.
Oops. All right, so thank you very much for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to lecture to you guys. So, you know, what I wanted to do today was really tackle two topics, measuring spatial frictions and then thinking about some of the implications of those spatial frictions. And I was wildly optimistic when writing the slides, and so there's way more material than I'll possibly be able to get through. So I'll go relatively quickly in places, but the slides are online if you want to follow up on some of the things later. Okay, so you know, broadly speaking, spatial frictions affect developing countries in many different ways. And in an hour and a half, I certainly don't have time to cover all of them. And so instead, I'm going to focus on one particular aspect today, which is spatial frictions that impede the movement of goods and services, which we often call trade costs. And so I won't be talking much about migration costs, which Melanie talked about in detail last week. Now, of course, these two may interact, and there's some recent economic geography models where you have frictions on both labor and goods moving between locations, and there's interesting implications of those, but I won't talk too much about that today. Okay, so as I mentioned, the kind of two questions we'll be talking about is first, you know, how large are these spatial frictions? Why do we care how large they are? Well, I mean, the obvious reason is if we're writing down models, and often quantitative models, trying to understand the impacts of these frictions or how things might change if you change these frictions, we kind of need some measures of the frictions. And so they're important inputs in that way. But also from a positive perspective, it's important to understand the trade data, understand why it has the features it does. That's not just for trade flows within or across countries. It's also true for international macro. Obstfeld and Rogoff have a very influential paper noting how possibly all of the 6 big puzzles of international macro can be explained, at least partially, through more realistic treatment of trade costs in those models. Okay, so that's why I think it's important to measure these things. If they are large, and they do appear to be, at least in developing countries, then what are the effects of reducing these frictions? It's kind of the second question I will talk about. There's obviously a vast amount of money spent on reducing trade costs. This is a big policy question, as well as a question of just pure academic interest, but trying to understand, for example, what was the benefit of a large road building project. We need to kind of know the answer to these questions. So I'll try and talk about both of these in the lecture today. Okay, so in terms of measuring trade costs, so what do we mean by trade costs? Well, roughly, broadly speaking, we're talking about all the costs that are going to impede our trade from moving between an origin O and a destination D. And that covers a range of things. The most well-known types of trade barriers are things like taxes or tariffs or transportation costs, like the cost of going across roads. But of course, there are many other impediments to the kind of movement of these goods, everything from kind of the need to pay bribes or corruption to contractual frictions, which are much more severe across space. This is Avner Greif's fundamental problem of exchange. You kind of have to put your trust that someone will deliver some goods to you after you've paid them, and that adds a complexity, particularly institutionally poor environments. There's also information frictions from doing business over space, not knowing, prices pertaining or preferences pertaining in various locations, which are less severe when you're doing business locally, or the need to secure finance while those goods are in transit. And obviously, the further you're shipping them, the longer they're going to be in transit. So all of these types of costs we group together into kind of trade costs. Okay, so the first question is, are trade costs large in developing countries? And there's some debate about this question, and we'll kind of try and shed some light onto it in the next few slides. A common argument is that a fundamental problem in the developing world is very high trade costs. Everything from very poor road quality to the need to pay lots of bribes at various points on these journeys, to poor contracting institutions. There's a nice Economist article from more than a decade ago now, entitled "The Road to Hell is Unpaved," which just kind of follows a beer truck on its deliveries in Cameroon as it has to travel across the country, with a lot of insight on some of these costs. So these types of stories would tell you that trade costs are very high in the developing world. But when you actually go and try and look at, say, shipping rates, they're not that high. If we look, within Africa on some of the more expensive land routes, at least in international terms, say Mombasa to Kampala or Douala to N'Djamena, prices are around 10 cents per ton. So, per ton kilometer. So, while those things can certainly add up, if you're shipping a container full of a kind of reasonably high value product, these are going to be kind of a small fraction of those costs. Also, if we look at kind of costs such as tariffs for international trade or taxes internally, those aren't necessarily that big. And where they are big, we often see in the developing world that they're massively evaded, and we'll talk more about that in due course. And so it's kind of de facto, they're not potentially such big barriers. And similarly, these kind of contracting problems, there's been some nice recent work by people like Rocco Machiavello showing how repeated games and reputations may circumvent a lot of these contractual issues. And we'll talk a bit about that later. And so, potentially these aren't as problematic as we might think. They don't impose such large costs. So how can we go about actually trying to put some numbers on this? Well, broadly speaking, there's kind of 3 ways we can measure spatial frictions, and I'll kind of touch on all 3. The first is kind of direct measurement. That's kind of the brute force approach, where we're just going to go out and try and measure some components of these transport costs. Now, some are quite easy to measure, things like transport prices, tariffs. Many aren't, and I'll talk about kind of some more creative ways of trying to estimate trade costs in developing countries directly in the next few slides. So there's kind of some nice work done at the World Bank where they essentially do something like the doing business surveys, if people are familiar with those, but for transportation costs. And in particular, they look at how easy it is to try and do things such as export products from a country. So here's for Burundi. You have to go through 17 different steps to export something from Burundi, everything from getting letters of credit to passing various technical controls. And they not only do they measure how many steps there are, but they also measure the time taken for each of those steps on average. And these are through surveys of freight forwarding firms around the world. And so here's the case of Burundi again, and you can see these 17 steps take a total of 70 days, 70. So that's an enormous number of days, and obviously this is one country, but this kind of tells you that these kind of measures of these freight forwarding firms can give us very large numbers, at least if we converted these time costs into sort of monetary terms. So, they don't just do this for Burundi, they do this for many countries. And as you might expect, these costs are much higher in the developing world than in developed countries. This may be a little misleading in the sense that even if you have a mean for, say, Africa and the Middle East of 41 days, as opposed to Europe of 22 days, maybe we should care more about the minimum and the maximum here. And there's kind of some work here by Lance Pritchett, who kind of points out that, when you look at these types of surveys, the kind of big firms who do a lot of trade, they've often worked out ways to do this quickly. If that involves, having very good relationships with government officials and such like, they pay the costs to do that. And so, maybe this isn't as big a deal as it seems, just because in terms of quantities, the people who are exporting a lot, they're able to get much more favorable conditions than if I want to just do one freight export once. And so this kind of standard deviation, these minimums and these maximums tell us that if you see kind of the minimum here ranges between 10 and 116, there's a lot of variation there. Okay, that's kind of by interviewing freight forwarders. You can also kind of survey people who travel along these routes. Ben Olken and co-authors have done work like this, thinking about trucking in Indonesia and thinking particularly about corruption. And they've just gone and worked out through surveys how much different costs add up to the kind of cost of moving goods between those locations. And they show that kind of bribes, whether that be extortion or protection payments, come to a substantial share of the costs of the trip. It's about 15% here of the cost, with fuel being about 50%. And those are everything from payments at checkpoints and at way stations to protection fees or convoy fees. And they can go and not only look at these averages, but also see how those payments vary along the trip. And they have this kind of nice model and result where they show, at least in one of the two routes that they look at, that these kind of bribe payments, the extraction that's going on, is increasing as you move closer to the end of the trip, and that's consistent with the idea that there's more surplus to extract as you're close to the end of the trip, and so some optimal extraction by some bribe taker would charge a higher price, demand a higher bribe close to the end of the trip. Okay, as I mentioned, when it comes to international trade, then often we see very or relatively high tariffs in developing countries, but again, that may be misleading if a lot of people are evading those tariffs. And Sandra Sequeira has a nice paper showing exactly that from Mozambique. Essentially, she compares before and after a reform which liberalized trade with South Africa and massively lowered the tariffs with South Africa. And she shows that prior to this kind of massive drop in tariffs, about 80% of shipments were paying a bribe to customs officials. And most of the time that bribe was for tariff evasion, which typically in this context means I'm shipping in something which should pay a high tariff. I pay the customs official through an intermediary to go and write that import down, rather than an import of steel that has a high tariff to write it down as an import of iron, which has a low tariff. And so this way they end up paying lower rates. And once you put in the kind of lower tariffs, then people stop paying bribes and they're willing to pay the tariffs. So the proportion paying a bribe falls from 80 to 26%, and the bribes that are still being paid are primarily to deal with congestion, to essentially get your stuff to move through faster rather than to pay a lower rate. One thing that's been noted in many other settings as well is just how cheap bribery is. The ratio of bribe amount to tariff duty saved is about 7%. So this has kind of been noted in many settings. These officials are not extracting all of the surplus, they're extracting surprisingly little of the surplus. You're getting a kind of big discount on your tariff savings for a bribe that's only 7% of the discount you're getting. Okay, so the kind of implications of that is that we should think about twice about these official barriers and how large they may be when there is substantial evasion. There's the final kind of direct measurement I'll talk about comes from Meredith Startz, and she has a very interesting paper where she goes and surveys Nigerian traders, mainly in goods such as clothing, electronics, etc. And she highlights that that distance creates essentially two problems. The first is kind of a search problem, which is I want to know what goods are available. Say I'm a trader in Nigeria, I want to know what the new products are in China. And it's hard for me to do that from Nigeria. And so that's kind of a search problem. Then there's also a contracting problem, which is, it's hard for me to trust that, once I send the money, they'll send the goods, or they'll send the right goods rather than some broken ones or not exactly what I ordered. And there again, that's much easier if you can go and hand over the money as you see the goods being transferred locally. Much harder if you're trying to do this from Nigeria and get them to kind of ship the goods from China. So what Meredith Startz tries to do is try to get a real handle on this just through setting up her own surveys and measurement. And there's this pretty stark finding, which is just how much travel is going on amongst these Nigerian traders. So this is kind of the fraction of shipments that they purchase where they end up traveling. As you can see, when they're kind of getting shipments from Togo, Ghana, Benin, countries nearby, it's cheap to travel there, and almost all the time they travel there before getting a shipment. Meanwhile, if they're going to these far off countries to buy from, such as the UK or China, then they're much less likely to travel, only maybe 30% of the time for China. It also costs a lot more to get there, about $2,500 per trip, including accommodation and visas, etc. And so unsurprisingly, they're less likely to go. But the thing that's kind of surprising here, at least compared to my priors, is just how many people are going. Even about 30% of transactions from China, there's kind of a trip by the trader to China associated with it. And these trips are expensive. Compared to the transportation or tariff costs on one of these trips where they actually travel rather than just order directly, the travel costs actually are more than the transportation and tariff costs. And so we worry a lot about how big are these tariffs, how much does it cost to move goods in trucks. We worry much less about how much does it cost for a trader and how easy is it for a trader to fly to China, spend a few days there and come back. And I should say, these trips aren't for people to stick stuff in their suitcase and fly back with it. the stuff typically travels in containers. These are really trips to work out what they want to buy and maybe to actually do the deal. Okay, so these costs are quite large. The third thing, which is maybe even more surprising, is that they keep on traveling even many years after they've started trading with a supplier. So just looking at this third column, there are trader and country fixed effects, and there's essentially no relationship for, say, a Nigerian trader who buys from China. They're just as likely they're just likely to travel to China when they're buying from someone they've bought from for many years versus someone they haven't bought from before. Okay, and this is kind of very surprising in terms of we would think that these contracting problems are alleviated substantially the longer your relationship is. You've built up a reputation and there's kind of repeated game here. And so you'd think that you would be able to trust them more and you travel less over time. And so that's a pretty stark finding. Finally, when you do travel, what are the benefits of traveling? Well, you get a lower unit cost. You're paying less for each unit that you buy. So you're better able to kind of pick the cheaper products. You're more likely to get new styles, especially when it comes to things like clothing. You're more likely to pick up kind of the latest fashions. You're more likely to add new suppliers. You're also spending a longer time between purchases. And you're buying bigger batches. So typically, when you travel, you go less frequently and buy bigger shipments, as you'd expect, given the large fixed cost of traveling. So these are all kind of suggestive facts, which kind of talk towards these two frictions we talked about earlier, of there both being kind of a search problem where I want to go and see what the products available are, and that's hard at distance, and a contracting problem that's also hard at distance. And so, starting to kind of think about a kind of measurement here going beyond direct measurement, Meredith writes down a model that's going to allow her to kind of back out the relative importance of these two frictions. And to do that, she's going to take a kind of monopolistic competition framework of trading firms and add a stocking problem. How much do I want to buy? There's a fixed cost of each purchase. So how much stock should I hold? A search problem where I'm looking for new varieties, and a contracting problem where you're going to have this repeated game, and there's moral hazard where they may default and just take your money and not send you the stuff or send you crappy stuff. And so you're trying to kind of play a repeated game. And what she shows, as in many repeated games, is in equilibrium, the trader is going to pay a premium to make sure that the seller doesn't cheat. Right, by making this relationship sufficiently valuable to them, it's in the interest of the kind of seller in China or in whatever country to send the goods after the payment. And how travel interacts with this is that travel both allows more up-to-date vintages of goods to be purchased. You're able to see the latest things and buy them. It also mitigates the temptation for the seller to cheat. Okay, it's now a kind of less worthwhile for the seller to cheat if you're traveling regularly, since these order sizes are going to be smaller. And so they're optimally deciding kind of how much to travel. And intuitively, what's going to kind of pin down how large the contracting friction is relative to the search friction is, the probability of me buying from the same supplier again is telling us about how important this contracting friction is. It's that continued relationship which is allowing us to solve this contracting friction problem by having a repeated game. Meanwhile, the choice of whether you travel versus order is pinning down the search friction. I can keep on ordering from you to solve that repeated game, but traveling versus ordering remotely, that's what's pinning down how important the search is for me. And so, using that intuition and the structure of her model, she shows that kind of both these frictions are important, and removing them together and there's some complementarity between them, increases welfare in the sector by about 14%, which is about 2/3 the gain from eliminating physical or regulatory costs that we normally think about as the kind of primary distance-related spatial frictions. The other thing that's interesting here, thinking about development more broadly, is, is this something unique to developing countries or not? And our answer is probably yes. And in particular, if Nigerian consumers acted like American ones, where they go to kind of very large shops like Walmart rather than go to markets and small traders, and when they do go to those shops, they spend much more because they're wealthier, then these types of travel costs become inconsequential. The travel costs of the Walmart buyer going to China doesn't really matter. It's one, 2 trips for millions of dollars of sales. It really does matter for Nigerian traders, where it's 1 trip for $50,000 of sales, or 1 trip for $30,000 of sales when that trip costs $3,000. The other reason this matters a lot for developing countries, and there's been a little more work on this since then, since Meredith's original paper came out, which was 4 or 5 years ago, is that international travel is particularly expensive for people from the developing world. Firstly, there are few flights, and so you often don't have direct flights to say, between where you live in Nigeria and the place you want to go in China. And so that adds to the cost. But the biggest cost is often visas, where it's often very expensive and takes a lot of time to obtain visas to travel to these countries in order to do this trade. And there are potentially very large gains to welfare from countries working out ways to reduce the hassle and cost of traveling internationally.
Can I ask a question?
Hello, David.
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. It seems a little bit that that this cost of traveling will be especially true for importers. So Nigerians traveling to the United States to import something. Is it so? Is this also the case for like exporters, and how that matters in this setting?
Yeah, so we don't have a similar study to this as detailed with microdata on exporters, but surely that's the case for exporters too. I guess exporters tend, at least African exporters, tend to be pretty large. And so potentially the scale of exporters is quite different to the scale of importers. But that's going to be an empirical question. My guess is that would be true in Nigeria, but may not be true in the US. But many of these same issues would occur. I mean, there's a question of, who's doing the traveling? If, why aren't the American firms traveling to Nigeria to buy from the Nigerian firms? And so, in some cases they might, in other cases, you may need to go to trade fairs to make people aware that Nigeria has these products and can export them. Obviously, not obviously, but it is true that developing country export promotion agencies spend a lot on doing exactly that. We may think that there are particular information frictions which make rich countries unaware of the product mix in poor countries, and poor countries well aware of the product mix in rich countries, or much better aware. And so you get this asymmetry, and policy may be needed to alleviate that. But it's an interesting question on kind of thinking explicitly about this asymmetry. Typically, papers have looked at one or the other rather than both of them at the same time.
Okay.
Excuse me?
Hello, David. Sorry. My question is with respect to the study we're reviewing. Does the study really account for a possible aggregation with respect to the importation of the goods? Because it's possible that the importer actually does the import for more than for other people, so thus reducing the cost of, say, because they now do larger importation. One importer taking care of like 10 small businesses, that kind of.
So I didn't give a lot of details about the study, and I recommend you read the paper. It's a very good paper. So most of these are wholesalers. So yes, they are de facto importing for many people because they're then selling to many shops. And so these are actually the orders that these guys do. They may not be, they're typically not the final seller of the goods. So yes, these guys are already importing de facto from many retailers. But you know, these are the actual flows that purchases made by these guys, even if they're grouping together orders that they're then going to go and sell on to other people.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Should I push on? Any other questions? Okay, so that's direct measurement. We've already seen a little bit of using some model structure to kind of back out spatial frictions, although not in detail. So easily the kind of most common way to kind of measure trade costs by backing them out from other information is backing them out from trade flows. And you know, the attractiveness of this is that we're only ever going to get so far by trying to measure the costs. Yes, we may do a decent job at measuring a handful of them, but it's just so hard to kind of get the full costs. For example, we may get the costs of you have to pay the shipper to move the good from A to B, but not the time costs and the hassle costs that involves at your end and filling out the forms. So the kind of most commonly employed way for getting the kind of full extent of trade costs is essentially exploiting a relationship we call the gravity equation. And that's basically a relationship between kind of trade flows and trade costs to some elasticity conditional on some fixed effects. And it's a particular way of inferring trade costs from trade flows, where the idea is very simple, which is we see how much trade there is in the real world. And then we compare that to how much trade, at least our model says there will be if there were no frictions. And the difference between the trade we actually observe and how much trade there should be with no frictions must be the trade costs. And then we're going to take that difference and call it our trade costs. And the kind of particular structure gravity puts on that is it gives us this particular specification. Typically, you derive this from CS preferences, identical across everyone in the world or everyone within the country, depending if you're doing internal or external trade costs. And it's less restrictive on the supply side. There's a range of supply side micro foundations, but in almost all cases, we're going to need the CS preferences. And that's going to give us a functional form as follows, which says the amount of trade or the log value of trade between I and J of good K is equal to something that depends on the origin country and good K, something that depends on the destination country and good K. So that might be, you know, how productive I am. This is going to be related to, you know, how big the demand is in B, plus every other country's access to those locations. And it depends on the trade costs between I and J for that good to some elasticity epsilon. Okay, and if you can write, if your model gives you this relationship, we say the model generates gravity. And you know what's nice about this structure is that essentially you know all the bits which are kind of a pain here about you know your own productivity and everyone else in the world's productivity as well as demands around the world are all captured in these two fixed effects. We're getting a lot of mileage from the CES preferences here, which is essentially telling us that you know I'm going to spend the same way on different goods, irrelevant of where they come from, just based on kind of how cheap they are. This is going to give us essentially a separability between my consumption and production decisions and the distribution of trade across the world. But if we're willing to buy this, and there's strong empirical support that this relationship holds reasonably well, then we can actually go and quite simply back out trade costs. And Head and Rees kind of have the kind of simplest way of doing this, which is let's make an assumption that intranational trade, i.e. trade with myself, tau II in good K is free. So that's making an assumption that there are no trade costs for trading between myself. If I'm thinking about, trade costs within countries, then this would instead be an assumption that trade within your location is free, and it's costly to trade outside your location. Then we can get a lot of mileage as long as we further assume that it's just as costly to send something from I to J as it is from J to I. So these costs are symmetric. That's not quite true. There's backhaul issues. If everyone wants to move stuff in one direction, it's often expensive to move it in one direction and cheap in the other way, as you have to get the trucks back. But we think it's a reasonable assumption in many settings. Then just very simple algebra, just essentially taking double differences of this expression for the gravity equation tells us that we can extract the tau ij to some elasticity just from this product of how much I trade with you, how much you trade with me, over how much I trade with myself, how much you trade with yourself. Okay, and essentially the logic here is, if you trade as much with other people as you trade with yourself, then we're down to there being no frictions. So you can think of this as maybe there are frictions for trading with yourself, and this is just a normalization. How much higher, how much more costly is it to trade with other people than it is to trade with myself? Okay, so this doesn't come for free, but it is very relatively simple to calculate. What do we need? Well, we need to know how much I trade with others. That's typically recorded, certainly in international trade data. Domestically, there's a number of countries and situations where we have trade flows within countries. So those are these two objects. And then we need to know how much I trade with myself. That's often a bit harder. Essentially, you're going to need to know how much you produce and how much you export. But if there's decent data on how much I produce, then I also know how much I trade with myself. And then finally, I'm going to need to know inelasticity. This is a hard object. This is an obvious object to need. Essentially, we're trying to back out, prices here from quantities. And to do that, we're going to need to know some elasticity. And so if you think you can estimate that elasticity or you have some outside source for it, then you can go and back out these tau ij's. Okay, so a lot of people have done this in many settings, internationally. The World Bank has even produced a trade cost database based on this inverse gravity, as they call it. Sorry, I cut off the log GDP per capita a label from the x-axis here. And here you can see kind of all of the estimates. These are aggregates for each of these countries for trade of different products to different countries. They break it up between manufacturing and agricultural products, and they're all bilateral, but these are just aggregates for each country. And as you might have expected, trade costs do appear to be higher for less developed countries. There's a pretty tight negative relationship. These countries in gray are all kind of small island nations. They seem to be kind of off the curve, which may not be so surprising. These are all landlocked countries in blue, which also may be slightly off the curve. But you can see this kind of general pattern. Maybe these aren't all landlocked countries. Yes, I guess they probably are. So, and so this is kind of some evidence for that earlier conjecture. Are trade costs particularly high in developing countries? Well, if you back them out in this way, then yes, they do relatively more trade with themselves than with others compared to rich countries. Okay, so that's kind of the extreme version of estimating trade costs from gravity, where I want to get the full trade costs from gravity. More common is I'm going to kind of take these gravity relationships and then, rather than trying to extract the full trade cost, which will involve that symmetry assumption we wrote down, as well as assuming that tau ii is 1. Instead, we can just kind of parameterize this function and then project this kind of residual on various observables like distance. And we find, as you might expect, that trade costs in terms of how much less do I trade with each other, with other countries than in a frictionless world, we do indeed find that declines with distance. So people have looked at a lot of different barriers in this way, whether we have kind of the same currency, whether we're both members of the WTO, roads, port access, etc., language barriers, colonial ties, information barriers based on kind of ethnic, shared ethnic networks, etc. Even a paper on whether or not a CIA-sponsored coup reduces kind of trade frictions. The answer to that seems to be yes. The CIA was kind of helping out American commercial interests. It's not necessarily that easy to go and aggregate all of these, although Anderson and Neary provide a way to do that. And there's a nice Anderson Van Winkoop Journal of Economics Literature trade cost chapter, which kind of summarizes some of the information on how important these various barriers are, language barriers, currency barriers, national borders, etc. Okay, so before moving on to kind of inferring trade costs from price gaps, there's a big issue here with identification. So this kind of gravity approach assumes that the reason that we don't trade with each other so much, say, let me take an example, the reason why a country trades a lot more with its neighbor than it trades with a country 500 miles away is because of trade costs. But there may be other reasons why those two countries trade more with each other. And the two obvious ones, which are kind of ruled out by the kind of inverse gravity approach we just talked about, is one, that integrated supply chains are choosing to locate near each other, right? In that kind of simple gravity structure, that tau ijk, what I'm calling trade costs, is potentially any combination of true trade costs plus a technology shock that's specific to that IJ pair, right? So if it's true that the things they produce are particularly good matches for the things I need, and there's kind of some input-output flows here, then we're going to call those trade costs. And I'll show you very briefly that we have strong evidence, certainly in developed countries, that there is a lot of this supplier location decisions. I build my big engine factory next to the car plant if I'm supplying the car plant to minimize trade costs. And we're going to say, oh, well, it must be because of the low trade costs. That's why you're trading so much with them. Well, no, it's because this is a specific input and they've decided to locate the factory next to mine. Similarly, this tau ijk is also going to pick up any demand shocks that are specific to an IJ pair. So if it's true that people in Chad particularly like the products made in Ghana, or the product K made in Ghana, the soups made in Ghana, then we're going to load that into there being low trade costs for soup within Ghana if we kind of use this separable gravity equation, which assumes everyone has identical preferences. I want to buy evenly from all the countries in the world, conditional on prices. So that's another assumption which is unlikely to hold, particularly if you think tastes are spatially correlated. And I have some work showing that indeed they are through a very simple mechanism, which is endowments are spatially correlated. The climate and the land is very similar in neighboring countries. And that means that historically they were producing similar types of things because they had similar endowments and they developed tastes for those types of things. And so, I'm more likely as someone who grew up in England to want to eat, the type of food a French person produces than the type of food maybe a Russian produces because I'm more used to those types of ingredients. So we have some evidence for both of these, as I mentioned. This is for the US. I haven't seen a similar study in a developing country, but my guess is you'd find some similar patterns, maybe not as extreme. This is from commodity flow surveys in the US. This is how much trade occurs across different distance bins using zip code to zip code truck movements. And you just see a colossal fall off in distance in the value of trade as soon as you move essentially out of the zip code. Right, so most trade is occurring within the same zip code in the US. And this is really strongly pointing towards, that engine plant locating next to my factory. Maybe I even own the engine plant. And most of the trade is going on in these very small different distances. And this doesn't seem like this is truly a transportation issue. Once it's loaded on the trucks, the difference between 10 versus 300 isn't so great that you'll see this just absolute fall off a cliff. And
sorry, can I ask something about that graph? So is that taking away non-tradables or services, or that includes like those type of goods?
Yeah, so this is just looking at truck flows and values moving in these trucks between zip code to zip code, or within zip code from the Commodity Flow Survey in the US. So they go and do basically a survey of shipments. So it's just goods moving in trucks. Maybe on trains as well.
Okay. How do we also account for possible trade agreements among countries?
I see. So that would be in typically what people have done is they've regressed these, say, gravity residuals on, say, being a member of the same trade agreement or something like that, and that matters. That's another one of these determinants of these trade costs. And so absolutely that matters, and there's a bunch of work looking at that, most notably by Andrew Rose. This is all movements within the US, so there's no trade agreements.
Yeah, I'm actually talking about the model we're looking at for international trade. So one would assume that if two countries have certain agreements, then maybe that could be a possible driver or an incentive for trade to improve between the two countries.
Absolutely. So if those trade agreements say lower tariffs or lower administrative burdens, that's going to lower the tau IJ. Sorry.
Yeah.
The tau IJ here, and we're going to recover that. That'll be something we capture, and then some people have then projected those recovered tau IJs or the residual, at least, on whether or not you have a regional trade agreement with that country, and the answer is yes, indeed. We are recovering those. That is part of what we're picking up.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, as I mentioned, these endogenous preferences, if you kind of just look at it, say Rajasthan in the west of India, the kind of price per calorie between rice and wheat is not that dramatically different, yet in Rajasthan, they're spending 31% of their budget on wheat. In the east of India and West Bengal, they're spending 57% of their budget on rice. Once I condition on relative prices, then the residuals are strongly correlated with kind of historic endowments that kind of determined what these regions were eating many centuries ago. And so there we would get this spatial correlation, which we would be loading in this case to trade costs. Okay, so the third method of measuring spatial frictions is going to be using price gaps. So there's a very large literature that does this, a lot of it in agricultural economics. And the basic idea is, instead of using values and quantities, instead we can actually do something quite non-parametric. We basically just need one key assumption to back out trade costs from the difference in prices if we have good price data. And so in particular, there's this arbitrage idea which says that the price difference between location J and location I for some good K, if there are goods flowing between those locations, must be equal to the cost of moving it between those locations. If the price was larger, the price gap was larger, then people would come in and go and compete away that price gap until it equals the trade cost, where this trade cost is a very expansive definition, including the cost of time of all the traders, etc. Okay, so if we're willing to buy that arbitrage assumption, which is a simple one and a single assumption, then we can potentially just back out these trade costs from price gaps. So there's kind of three challenges here. The first is we have to observe the same product in both locations. It's no use observing rice in one location and rice in another, if the rice in location I is low quality and the rice in location J in a big city is high quality, then we're not really comparing like with like, and some of that price difference is the quality difference. Secondly, we need to know if the countries, if the two locations are actually trading the product. If they're not trading, then this isn't an inequality. It isn't an equality, it's an inequality. We know that the price gap is less than or equal to that trade cost. The price gap could be sufficiently small that there's actually no one wants to go and pay those costs of moving goods between the two. It's not that easy to know if two locations are trading, and the reason is if you want to have a really homogeneous product, the trade data is typically not at that level. We don't see, trade at the level of, cans of 330 milliliter cans of Coke. We see trade at the level of beverage or carbonated beverage with sugar. And so we're not going to be able to see that. And if we're looking at domestic trade costs, then we don't often even have trade flows within locations. Third challenge is we have to believe in perfect arbitrage, which also means believing in perfect competition, that there's kind of enough people coming in here competing away any rents from arbitrage, or we have to correct for this. So I'll talk in a few minutes about Dave Donaldson's paper on railroads in India that kind of solves problems 1 and 2 using SALT. Now I'll talk a little bit about my work with Dave Donaldson, which attempts to solve all 3 of these, or at least make progress on all 3 of these. I should just mention that there's some ag econ work and econ history work that's tried to use the inequality itself and make some progress there. Okay, so what do we do in our paper? So how do we solve these challenges? So the first is we have to observe homogeneous products. So what we're going to do is we're going to collect a sample of barcode level products from CPI data in Nigeria and Ethiopia, and we'll have a benchmark of the US. And this is going to give us kind of it's going to give us price quotes for things like that 330 milliliter can of regular Coca-Cola in different locations. We also have to know whether locations are trading that product, and we're going to be looking at trade costs within Nigeria, trade costs within Ethiopia. And so what we're going to do is we're going to have price quotes at various different cities or markets, and we're also going to know the factory location of those products, and so that's going to tell us, whether or not there's actually trade occurring, where we know that trade's, only occurring on or almost exclusively occurring on routes where where the origin is the factory location. Okay, so does it matter us restricting attention just to trading pairs? Well, the answer is yes. So here are 3 countries: Ethiopia, Nigeria, the US. All I'm plotting here is the price gap, the difference in price between either I and J, the absolute difference if I use all pairs, or if I'm using trading pairs, the destination price minus the origin price. And I'll plot this against the distance between those two. And if we look at the dashed green line, these are for all pairs, we can see that it is indeed the case that the price gap goes up the further away you are from, the further apart the 2 locations are. If I'm doing the origin destination, the price gap goes up the further away I am from the origin. And the slope of this curve is telling us the marginal cost of distance, the derivative of this trade cost function with respect to distance. And as you can see, it matters quite a lot that we restrict attention to these informative pairs, these trading pairs, rather than these pairs which aren't trading, which aren't very informative beyond potentially adding to the moment inequality. And indeed, the marginal cost of distance, at least in Ethiopia and Nigeria, approximately doubles once we account for the fact we should only be focusing on these informative pairs. That arbitrage equality doesn't tell us about the non-trading pairs. Okay, what about that third problem? The perfect competition. So that's a strong assumption, given that we hear a lot of anecdotes about oligopolistic traders or market power amongst traders. And so we kind of try and tackle that head on by writing down a relatively simple model where there are oligopolistic traders who are buying at the factory gate and then moving the good across space and selling it to the final consumer at a markup. And so in that world, the price gap, the destination price minus the origin price, is equal to the trade costs of going between O and D, as well as the markup being charged by these traders when they sell at D. And this kind of gives us a way to potentially correct for the bias that's caused when we, in that simple plot I showed you before in these blue curves, where we don't account for the fact that there may be imperfect competition in the trading sector. And the logic is as follows. So the markups are, if they're constant, then that's not going to be problematic. But what is going to be problematic is if these markups respond to higher trade costs, i.e. if markups are differential in more remote or more proximate locations to the origin. In general, they will be. And the reason they will be is that other than in knife-edge cases, markups respond to marginal costs. Either markups are higher or markups are lower when marginal costs go up, depending on something called the superelasticity, the second derivative of the demand function. And higher trade costs, that's part of the trader's marginal cost. It's one of the kind of two components, along with buying at the factory gate, the price they pay in their marginal costs. And so if it is the case that we're regressing price gaps on a distance, for example, then we're confounding both the fact that trade costs are going up with the fact that markups are also changing with these higher trade costs. And the way we kind of can deal with this is this kind of idea that if we can observe another marginal cost shifter, and we're going to in particular be able to observe the price pass-through rate, which is how kind of the prices in the destination respond when there's a change in the price in the origin. That's basically the other component of the trader's marginal cost, how much they're paying for the good at the factory gate. If we observe those price pass-through rates, and we can do that just from price data by seeing how shocks at a price in the origin feed through to shocks in the destination, that's going to tell us exactly what we need to know about how the markup responds in any particular location for any particular product. Okay, and so we don't need to go and work out for every location, every product, the superelasticities, those demand parameters, or the market structure, both of which are going to matter for this pass-through rate. The pass-through rate is exactly what tells us how that markup is going to change when marginal costs change. And so we can use that pass-through rate to essentially correct our estimates of the change in prices with distance from what is the change in the markup, and the remaining derivative is the change in trade costs with respect to distance. Okay, and so that's basically what we do, and there's many more details in the paper on how we deal with other potential confounders. But once we do that, we find another approximate doubling, and so this imperfect competition essentially leads us to underestimate the slope of distance, the marginal cost of distance in developing countries. Once we account for that, the marginal cost of distance appears to be about 3 to 5 times higher in Ethiopia and Nigeria than in the US, again, supportive of there being these much higher trade costs within developing countries than within developed countries. We also can say a little bit more about implications of these high trade costs in developing countries, something we'll turn to in the rest of the lecture today when I talk about the impacts of infrastructure. And essentially what we can say is two things. Thinking about this thought experiment whereby imagine there's a kind of a big increase in globalization. How does that affect people in Nigeria? How does that affect people in Ethiopia? And so the kind of idea here is imagine prices fall at the port because, lower tariffs, better logistics, whatever it is. Now in Lagos or the entry point into Ethiopia, you can now buy cheaper imports. How does that benefit people across Ethiopia, across Nigeria? Well, if I live in a remote location in Ethiopia or Nigeria, then there's kind of a smaller increase in the pie when there's kind of improvements at the border. Why? Well, I'm not buying very much from abroad anyway because it's so costly to get it to me that a change in the price on the border has relatively little effect. In the extreme, if I'm so isolated, it's not worth me buying any of these imports because they're so expensive. Then I'll be not affected at all by a price change at the border. The second fact is that, because these remote locations have these high costs of trade to get goods to them, that means they're not very profitable for the intermediaries because they have to charge these really high prices just to cover their trade costs. And so because they're not very profitable, few traders enter. And because few traders enter, they're also not very competitive trading markets. And that means the markups are really high as well. And for that reason, that means that a smaller share of the surplus that is going to these locations is going to consumers rather than going to traders or deadweight loss. And we find kind of both of those effects in our paper. Okay, so let me kind of change tack a little bit now. And in the last 15 minutes, let me talk about estimating the impacts of spatial frictions on outcomes such as welfare. And here I'll take a deep dive into Dave Donaldson's paper as a kind of very nice example that matches up very nicely with Melanie's lecture last week, who kind of introduced kind of the basic structure of these models. And I'll talk about the implementation of one of those. If I have a few minutes at the end, I'll also talk about a reduction in information frictions and how that affects trade and the fund size distribution in India. Okay, so maybe the primary way that governments intervene to reduce trade costs is through infrastructure investment, whether it's building railroads or roads or better ports or cell phone networks. But it's not easy to identify the effects of infrastructure, and that's for two potential substantial confounds. The first is that, where government puts infrastructure may be in exactly the places which were expected to grow the most. So, in a booming country, think about China in the 1980s or early 90s, they may have decided, let's go and, build roads to connect the kind of most important cities. Those are the places we expect are going to, really grow anyway. And anticipating that, you're trying to kind of put infrastructure in response to that. There, what you'll do is you'll kind of overestimate the effect of infrastructure. A lot of this would have happened without the infrastructure. The opposite may also be true, which is the government may use infrastructure as a tool to boost poorer areas. The EU spends a lot of its money on boosting, on giving infrastructure to poor areas so they can catch up. So in that case, you'd get the opposite. You'd underestimate the impacts of infrastructure since it's going to the areas that are kind of least likely to grow. Okay, so Dave Donaldson tries to tackle these questions by looking at the expansion of railroads in colonial India and asking if it kind of promoted development, particularly agricultural development, which was most of the economy at that point in time. And he's able to kind of capture very well with the data available. And if it did benefit agricultural development, which is something that can be answered at least in part by reduced form approaches, were those gains caused by reduced trade costs? And here he's going to lean heavily on the kind of Eaton-Corton style version of a spatial model that Melanie talked about in the last lecture, and use a kind of inferential technique where essentially what he's going to do is estimate the reduced form impacts and see whether or not those reduced form impacts can be mostly or entirely explained by a model-based sufficient statistic for what the benefits of the infrastructure should have been through the lens of a model where all of those benefits are purely coming from trade. And so we're going to kind of talk through this as a kind of a bunch of insight at various points in this paper. Okay, so here's kind of the transportation network in 1853 in India. You can see there's a tiny railway line in Bombay, and very rapidly the railway line started growing. 1860, 1870, 1880, 1890, 1900, 1910, 1920, 1930. By that point in time, it effectively looks like it does today. There hasn't been that much investment since then, and it now covers most of India. So what we can do is try and explore what the impacts are of this massive expansion of the railroad up until the 1930s, to various Indian outcomes, particularly things that try to map into welfare and trade flows. Okay, so a bit of background, what is India at this point in time? How do we think about it? So it's primarily an agricultural economy. It's about 2/3 of its GDP in agriculture, almost no factory-based manufacturing. Most of that agriculture is rain-fed. There's very, very little irrigation. And so that's going to be a very nice setting, which is we have good data on agriculture typically, and that's going to cover most of the economy, and we'll be able to use rainfall as observable and exogenous shocks to productivity. Okay, so what exactly is this railway shock? So it's basically a new technology that's massively better than the existing technology. Previously, it was some combination of bullocks traveling on roads. It may take 2 to 3 months to reach the port. Rivers, which are very seasonal and slow, and coasts, which have kind of limited port access for the newer ships. Meanwhile, railroad is massively fast compared to the alternatives, about 600 kilometers per day. It's safe. There's limited piracy, which was a big issue on many of these other routes. And it's much cheaper. So, in order to get your good to market, say to port, it's going to be about 4 to 4.5 times cheaper than roads, about 2 times cheaper than the coast, which obviously can only go to certain places, at least based on some outside estimates. This is really a massive change, and we're going to try and see the impacts of this change. So, as I mentioned, the kind of empirical exercises are going to be very tightly guided by a general equilibrium spatial model. And in particular, it's going to be a multi-sector extension of Eaton and Cortum. So there's going to be many regions, many goods, think rice, think wheat, and trade costs, iceberg trade costs. And each of these goods, there's a continuum of varieties, a different variety produced by each location. And we're going to have a continuum of varieties even within locations. And we're going to have origins, destinations, O origins, D destinations. Okay, so the production technology is quite simple. There's constant returns to scale. There's a single factor here. It's just going to be labor. And so that means that kind of the only incomes here are going to be rental rates from labor. That's R. Think of it like, one factor land, and there'll be rental rates on land R. You can think of this as very similar to a model which only has one factor labor, where wages are the returns to that factor. The productivity of a kind of unit of land is this Z, which is different depending on O and K and across the different varieties J. And the price, because of perfect competition here, is simply going to be equal to the rental rate over the productivity. Okay, like in Melanie's lecture last week, we're going to have an extreme value distribution that you're drawing productivities from. That extreme value distribution is going to depend on some productivity that's specific to the origin for that good. This is going to be where rainfall is going to enter. That's going to essentially change the probability of getting a high or low draw. And then this theta K, which is affecting the dispersion of productivities across locations, that's what's going to be generating a comparative advantage. That's going to be generating kind of gains from trade is this dispersion parameter. The more dispersion, the bigger benefits from trade. Okay, what are our preferences? So we're going to have Cobb-Douglas across different goods, across wheat, across rice. That's that mu here. And then CES within these goods, as in a lot of these modern spatial models, where epsilon is this elasticity of substitution across other varieties within rice. And there'll be some iceberg costs of trading, T, where if I want to consume a good produced in O in location D, I have to pay this iceberg cost TKOD on top of the price in the origin. Okay, so the kind of magic of these extreme value distributions in this particular model is consumers are facing many potential suppliers. They consume the cheapest variety, the cheapest version of each variety. And what this is going to give us is a very tractable expression, thanks to the extreme value for the expected price in each location. That's going to depend on these rainfall shocks. This is a function of the gamma distribution that also depends on theta, this lambda term, and it's going to depend on these trade costs and rental rates in O, and the trade costs we know in D, and this dispersion parameter. Okay, and this is going to make things very tractable and generate gravity relationships as well. Okay, so there's kind of four main predictions that Dave's going to bring to the data. The first is that if a good O can only be made in one region, but this good is consumed elsewhere, then because of the kind of perfect competition in this model, the price gap between the two is just going to equal those trade costs of moving the good between the two locations. And we're going to leverage this for the a particular product salt, and I'll explain why in a minute, to kind of back out the function underneath underlying T. If we know, these price gaps, we know T, then if I know the full road network and rail network and coastal shipping network, I can then parameterize the relative costs of those different means of transport by essentially working out kind of the best fit to hit these price gaps. The second prediction is exports take the gravity form that we kind of already talked about earlier in this lecture. In particular, the kind of imports of good K from O into location D depend on both the kind of rain shocks in location O, how productive they are in location O because of the good rainfall. This dispersion parameter that's kind of telling us how much these things vary across locations, plus these trade costs. And what this gravity equation is going to allow us to do is, if we have data on these trade flows, and we will have data on these trade flows, and if we're able to back out this T function, which we will be able to from the previous regression, then we can also back out theta, which is this kind of key elasticity, which is this dispersion parameter, by essentially regressing the log of this object on the log of the trade costs. We can also back out the mapping between rainfall and this A. The A term, this residual, is going to be a residual, which we can then see how rain affects that A, and then we're going to be able to use that very shortly. Then in terms of, both of those are useful in terms of allowing us to get the key parameters of this model. Then in terms of actually thinking about welfare effects, we can look at the impacts on real income levels, i.e. welfare. In this model, because we just have a single factor, welfare is simply my wage, or the rental rate in this case, because of the single factor being land, divided by the price index. Dave shows, at least around a symmetric equilibrium, that when I get a railroad to my origin, that's good for me. It means I can now sell my stuff more cheaply, so my sales go up to others, and I can buy stuff from others more cheaply, and that helps my price index. Meanwhile, if others get a railroad, but it doesn't connect to me, that's bad. And why is that bad? Well, now another location that previously bought from me will buy from other locations because it's kind of cheaper to buy from those other locations. And so we can go and test this in a very kind of reduced form way. And then kind of the key test in the paper of whether or not, what we find in those regressions is indeed coming about through trade flows is this kind of model-derived expression for welfare, which says that despite all of these complex G interactions, welfare can be written as a function of a constant, of something that depends on these productivity shocks, which I'm going to have a way to measure thanks to rainfall and the fact I have a mapping between rainfall and A. And I know the theta, and I can easily get the mu, which is just a Cobb-Douglas share spent on different goods. And this pi OOK term, which Dave calls the autarkicness, which is essentially how much I trade with myself. And the more I trade with myself, the more autarkic I am, and the lower is my welfare. The more I trade with others, this number goes down and my welfare goes up. And so at least through the structure of this model, despite the complex spatial GE model, essentially everything that's happening due to trade is going to be loaded in how much changes how much I trade with myself. If I still trade as much with myself before as I did after, then essentially the railroads haven't given me any benefits through trade. If I trade more with others and less with myself, then this tells us exactly how that should affect welfare. And what we can do is we can see if indeed our welfare changes that we can measure from rents over price indices do respond to autarkicness as the model predicts. Okay, so in the interest of time, I should go fairly quickly, and I'll try and wrap up in a couple of minutes, Doug, if that's okay. How does Dave actually go and implement this? Well, as I mentioned, these price gaps, we need a product, as we talked about, that we know where it's made and is homogeneous. And it turns out in India, the colonial government of the British was attempting to control the population by essentially they made it illegal for you to make salt yourself. Gandhi famously violated that as a protest. And salt was only made in 8 different locations in India and was very tightly controlled, and it was taxed heavily. It was a major source of revenue. And so what you can essentially do is you can see the price of different types of salt in different locations because the salt was essentially tagged with where it came from for these regulatory purposes. And so here's where the salt mines are in red. Here's where we have price data on the salt, which is tagged by the location where the salt came from. And then we can see how over time those prices changed when railroads were added, which made it cheaper or less expensive to kind of move salt between those different regions. And so, essentially what we'll do, as I mentioned, is we'll kind of project those price gaps, which come from the kind of price we observe in a particular destination and a fixed effect, which is specific to that variety of salt in that location. So that's sweeping out the origin price. And then the residual, we're going to project on the road network and the rail network and the coastal river network, and a bunch of parameters which say how costly different means of transport are relative to each other. And we're going to find the alphas, the parameters that best fit this relationship. That's going to tell us how costly road is relative to rail, and the numbers you get line up relatively well with the kind of figures I showed you before that came from kind of observers at the time. We can also do kind of more reduced form things like see whether these price gaps decline when there's a railroad between the origin and the destination and a railroad gets built, and indeed they do. They fall by about 11% when the salt price falls by around 11% when I connect to these locations. There's a nice placebo, I guess it got cut from the final version of the paper, but it's maybe my favorite column in the paper where Dave shows that when you're trying to move camels, elephants, carts, and inland boats, we don't see such an impact of the railways. And the reason for that is all of these things are bigger than railway carts are. And so you can't stick them on railway carts. Okay, so with those estimates of T in hand, which I've kind of backed out from those price gaps, I can now go and see whether this gravity regression from this gravity regression, I can go back out this parameter theta, this key dispersion parameter in the fresh A inside the extreme value distribution by projecting the gravity, the import shares on these trade flows. And then I can take the residuals and work out how A, K, or O, these are the productivity shocks, depend on rainfall. And that mapping we're going to need shortly. And then the kind of key reduced form regression here is I'll regress real income in each location on whether or not they had a railroad link in their district and whether your neighbors had a railroad link. And as a kind of at least first order a prediction from the model would say, I benefit when I have a railroad in my location. In fact, my real income goes up by 16%. And I lose out conditional on me having a railroad when my neighbor gets a railroad, as more people are purchasing from them rather than from me. So there's kind of support for these model predictions. And then what we're going to want to see is, whoops, hold on a second. What we're going to want to see is how much of this is driven by the mechanism proposed in the model, i.e. By trade itself. And here we'll add those two extra terms the model predicts, and the model says just these two things should matter. It's something to do with A's, which are rainfall times this kappa coefficient we've estimated, plus your autarkicness, which we've also been able to take out of the data. And once we kind of use these model predicted impacts of the railroads, we find there's no longer an effect of me having a railroad in the district or a railroad in the neighboring district. All that matters is what the model says should matter, which is your autarkicness. So this is kind of a very elegant way to show that indeed these substantial increases in welfare are indeed coming about through the mechanism of greater trade and being able to exploit this comparative advantage that the model would predict, and these gains are large. And the final thing, you can read the slides or read the paper, is there's a whole bunch of placebo checks that are very compelling, involving lines that weren't built, but were planned, and we don't find effects on those. Instrumental variables using rainfall, which predicted the famine, and the Famine Commission built railway lines afterwards in response to the famine, as well as bounds using lines which were labeled as commercial, military, or redistributive, which should have very different biases, but we find similar effects in all those cases. Okay, so in the interest of time, I should probably wrap up. As I mentioned, there's a nice paper by Rob Jensen and co-authors on information frictions, showing what happens to the boat building industry in various towns in India when now there's a kind of free flow of information of the various attributes of firms in different locations, and how we get very merits-like adjustments to that. But I'll leave that for you guys to read up in the slides. So just to conclude, we were really only able to touch the surface of the vast literature on the effects of spatial frictions in developing countries. There's a couple of nice review articles, none of which maybe cover all of this, but which get at this in parts. There's a very nice Annual Review of Economics article on the gains from market integration, not development specific, but very relevant here. I have a review article on trade and development, which touches on a bunch of these issues, although also on other issues. I think about kind of distortions, not just spatial ones, more generally. And then there's a couple of recent papers thinking about economic geography, either urban economics or spatial frictions within cities, as well as spatial frictions across locations in trade and geography. Again, the latter one's not development specific, but as some of those papers are. Okay, so thank you very much for listening, and I'm very happy to open the floor to questions for the rest of the time.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, David. Let me open this to the front row.
Yeah, I would have a quick question, which was about your 2015 paper, where you were saying that it was very important that you could show that there was actual trade going on. You said in that case you collected data on the factory. I was wondering whether you could maybe repeat that, like exactly what you did there to ensure that, and maybe share any ideas on a good approaches for us to see whether trade is actually occurring, maybe strategies to find that out most easily, or any learnings you might have had from that project.
Okay, so in that case, we just did it by brute force. We had RAs call up all of the companies or find newspaper articles about factory openings, etc. And in Africa, they were actually pretty willing to hand over the information. In the US, more were skeptical of, why do we need to know exactly where my garlic and onion ragu pasta sauce is made? I told you where we make pasta sauce. But we managed to at least get about 100 products that way. Obviously, there is some reselling going on, and so there's still some measurement error attached to that, and maybe some smuggling. across the border where they come in from other factories, but we think those effects will be somewhat minimal. So that is on what we did there. Lauren Bergquist has a nice paper with Craig McIntosh. I guess they haven't published the paper yet, or haven't got a working paper yet, but has the data collection which they use in another paper now with Ben Faber and Ted Miguel and others, where she went and did surveys where she basically asked traders, I believe, where the flows were occurring within the country. So where did you get, this stuff you're selling? Where did it come from? There's also many countries have trucking surveys, maybe subsamples, which may have information on that. And the final source here would be sometimes market surveys also ask for the origin of locations. And so, in my mind, you're not, if you have a setting which you've already got lots of other data on, you've already written the paper on, you may not be able to find this data. But if you're trying to do something from scratch, there are plenty of places you can get this data. Sorry, there may be a little bit of an invasion as my son's just come home from the park. Anyway, he likes people, so it should be okay. So yes, I think there are many countries you can find this type of data, but it's not necessarily available for the products you already have in the country you're already working on. And so it depends on how important this type of thing is, whether you kind of look in those settings or not.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Yeah, I have a small question just out of curiosity. When you presented the how trade costs change by distance, or how the price gap changed by distance, in the US, the price gap becomes negative on the trading pair only thing. But then sorry.
Right.
I guess why do you think that is? That this
so I'm forgetting if that's the trading pair or the non-trading pair.
Yeah, with
right,
trading pairs.
The obvious explanation or remaining explanation is that the markups must differ across space, and there so happen to be higher markups in proximate locations and more distant locations. The thing that's unusual about the US compared to Nigeria and Ethiopia is Nigeria and Ethiopia, basically all the factories are in the big cities, often in the hub of the country, either in Lagos or close to Addis. And so there we have a very different relationship compared to the US, where maybe you have factories spread out across the US, and then the big cities are like West Coast, Chicago, East Coast, and so you get very different kind of relationships in these urban versus rural price differences, or bigger cities versus smaller price mid-city price differences, which are related to markups, seem to be generating that pattern.
Thank you.
It's a quiet group at the moment, which I think may just also reflect the fact that for people on this side of the Atlantic, it's the end of the day on a Friday. So if I'm not hearing any more questions, I think maybe what I would just do is ask those who are in the front row to unmute and join me in giving David a round of old-fashioned applause. So, thank you so much, David, for taking the time and for sharing your knowledge with us, and again for doing this out of the goodness of your heart. We really appreciate it. It's a great lecture, and lots of useful links for people to follow. So I think these review articles are available. I think before your young company comes back into the room, we might just want to let you go, David, and again to thank you enormously for taking the time. So yeah,
and thank you all for a great questions, and also for sticking around. I think this is the last official lecture or so of the course, so congratulations if you've attended all of the official non-bonus lectures. And I'm happy if anyone has any further questions, just reach out to me at atkin@mit.edu, and I'm happy to reply or wanted to ask about related things. So thanks a lot.
Just to say though that we do have 2 supplemental lectures for next week on Thursday and Friday. So continuing the spatial frictions theme in a sense. So Natalie Raimondo will be talking about trade, FDI, and development, and then Klaus Desmet will be talking about urbanization. So I think, as you'll all appreciate, the partialing out of the lectures into core lectures and supplemental was kind of arbitrary, but I think those will very much follow and fit with what you've seen from Melanie and from David. And so we look forward to seeing people back next week. So maybe on that note, I'll just again say thanks, David.